Welcome to Short Movie Channel. Our movie today begins in the ocean, where we see the body of a girl suddenly falling into the water. She then floats back to the surface and opens her eyes. At that moment, Brandon wakes up, and we realize it was a terrifying nightmare. Brandon works as a bodyguard for Ava, the daughter of the city's governor. Later, Brandon and Ava head to the airport, where Ava meets her friends, Jade and Kyle. They were planning to travel together to Cabo Island. However, Jade and Kyle are not happy about Brandon joining them. Jade talks to Ava saying, "We can't take Brandon with us on this trip." But Ava responds that her father insisted Brandon accompany her, otherwise he wouldn't have allowed her to travel. Jade expresses frustration with her father's controlling nature. Ava apologizes to him, reassuring him that Brandon's presence won't bother them at all. Ava then thanks Brandon for agreeing to join the trip, explaining that she feels safe with him. We find out that Ava herself convinced Brandon to come along to protect her. When they board the plane, Ava asks Brandon for permission to sit with Jade and Kyle in economy class. Strangely, we notice that there are very few passengers on the plane. Shortly after, the plane takes off, but it suddenly starts shaking in the air. At first, it seems normal, but the turbulence continues, causing concern among the passengers. The flight attendant, Danilo, tries to calm everyone down, saying they might have hit a flock of birds or encountered some air pockets. A young girl named Rosa looks out her window and notices the engine overheating. Moments later, the plane shakes violently again, and the engine catches fire. The pilot instructs all passengers to stay in their seats and fasten their seat belts. Suddenly, a large piece of the engine breaks off, slams into the side of the plane, and kills a passenger. The air pressure inside the cabin drops dramatically, causing luggage to fall on the passengers and creating chaos. Some passengers who didn't secure their seat belts are pulled out of the plane by the strong airflow. Brandon tries to grab one of them but can't due to the overwhelming force. Another passenger holds onto a seat, but the seat detaches and gets sucked out as well. The scene inside the plane is catastrophic, with one of the flight attendants attempting to save a passenger but getting pulled out with them. The pilot completely loses control, and the plane begins to descend rapidly. Finally, it crashes into the ocean, and water starts flooding the cabin. The intense force of the water pushes the seats, injuring Brandon with a sharp piece of metal. Many passengers are crushed between the seats and die instantly. The plane continues sinking for several minutes until it finally settles on rocks near the ocean floor. However, we discover that the rear section of the plane, where the economy class is located, hasn't been flooded. We see that Ava, Jade, Kyle, and the flight attendant Danilo are still alive. At that moment, Brandon notices the little girl, Rosa, and her grandmother, Marty. He approaches them and takes them to the rear section of the plane. As soon as he opens the door and enters where Ava and the others are, they find that Grandma Marty is completely unconscious. Danilo performs first aid on her, successfully reviving her and bringing her back to consciousness. Meanwhile, Rosa and Marty seem anxious about Rosa's grandfather and Marty's husband, who was on the plane with them. Brandon replies, telling them that he didn't survive. This news shocks everyone, leaving them overwhelmed with sadness, fear, and dread about the fate awaiting them. Brandon tries to reassure them, explaining that they're currently safe because there's oxygen in the air here and that the best course of action is to wait for the rescue team. Ava tries to use her phone, but there's no signal or internet connection. She then notices an opening in part of the plane and suggests they could swim through it to escape. Brandon opposes her idea, stating that their chances of survival outside are very slim, if not non-existent, and that it's better to stay where they are. Danilo agrees with Brandon, adding that the plane's captain had communicated with air traffic control and the airport before the crash, providing them with coordinates and reporting everything that had happened. Brandon then tells everyone that the most important thing now is to find spare oxygen tanks before the available oxygen runs out. Danilo mentions that there are 2 emergency oxygen tanks in the rear section of the plane. He quickly goes to retrieve them, but to his shock, he discovers they're both empty. At that moment, Marty recalls seeing one of the passengers in the front section of the plane with a medical oxygen tank. Brandon volunteers to swim to the front section to retrieve the oxygen tank. Marty also asks him, if possible, to bring her husband's hat as a keepsake. Brandon dives into the water and swims toward the submerged front section. He makes his way through the aisle, passing between seats and the bodies of deceased passengers, until he reaches Marty's husband's body and retrieves the hat. Through the plane's window, Brandon notices a shark swimming nearby in the water. He also spots the oxygen tank he was looking for. Despite the danger, he decides to explore further into the plane, hoping to find anything else that could be useful. Suddenly, he's attacked by the shark, which has entered the plane with him. Back in the rear section, the group begins to worry about Brandon, sensing that something is wrong. Moments later, Brandon reappears, struggling to breathe and unable to speak. He tosses them the hat and delivers the oxygen tank, asking Ava to take good care of herself. Just then, the shark pulls Brandon back into the water. The group watches in horror as the shark devours him in an instant. In shock, they retreat further into the plane, realizing that their only option now is to stay where they are and wait for whatever comes next. Grandma Marty offers to take care of Kyle's broken arm and tells them she used to work as a nurse during the war. She mentions that this is where she met her husband, fell in love, and got married. Kyle screams in agony as Marty pushes the broken bone in his arm back into place. She then makes him a temporary splint using magazines and thick bandages. The scene shifts to the surface of the water, where a rescue helicopter is flying over the area where the plane went missing. The rescue team moved quickly because they knew that Ava, the governor's daughter, was among the plane's passengers. However, they couldn't find any trace of the plane wreckage on the water's surface. We return to the group inside the submerged plane. They hear a noise, as if the plane is moving for a few seconds, making Jed feel extremely terrified. Meanwhile, Danilo checks the oxygen tank Brandon had retrieved earlier. Suddenly, the water around them turns red, resembling blood, and they hear noises and see a lot of movement in the water. They realize sharks have entered the plane and started feeding on the dead passengers' bodies. The plane begins shaking again, and they see sharks swimming near them through the plane's windows. Rosa is terrified and starts crying. Ava hugs her, trying to reassure her by saying, "Don't be afraid. I'm sure the rescue teams will get to us soon." The group starts discussing their situation and realizes they only have 3 to 4 hours before the water fully submerges the plane. They also notice water leaking from the plane's ceiling, indicating it won't hold up against the strong water pressure for much longer. Suddenly, the plane shifts again and sinks a little further, causing rocks to fall with it. Luckily, no one gets injured, but the new angle of the plane causes the water level to rise faster inside. They realize the only solution is to swim out before the plane sinks further into the depths. However, they need to find a way to distract the sharks. Rosa suggests that sharks are afraid of water bubbles and that creating bubbles might keep them away. Despite this, the group faces another challenge: how to hold their breath underwater for long periods. Kyle remembers seeing some passengers at the airport carrying swimming and diving equipment. Danilo suggests those items might be in the plane's storage area, accessible through a hatch. Ava volunteers to swim to retrieve the equipment. But before doing so, she goes into the restroom, locks the door, and completely breaks down, overwhelmed by the situation. Meanwhile, above the water, the rescue helicopter finally spots the plane wreckage. 2 divers jump into the water and begin searching for the submerged plane. It doesn't take long before they find it. One diver approaches the window, and the group inside waves frantically at him. The second diver heads underneath the plane. Suddenly, a shark appears behind the diver at the window without him noticing. The group tries to warn him by waving, but he sees nothing. As he turns around again, the shark attacks him and drags him away, killing him instantly. The group watches in horror as the diver's severed leg, covered in blood, floats in the water. They assume the second diver has also been killed, as he's nowhere to be seen near the plane or in the surrounding area. Realizing the sharks have likely taken him as well, their fear and despair only grows stronger. At this moment, the helicopter's fuel was about to run out, so they quickly left the area to get help from rescue teams. The film then takes us back to the surviving team on the plane. Ava tells them, "We can use the oxygen tanks that belong to those divers." Jed tries to stand on one of the seats to get a better view down the corridor, but the seat collapses, and he falls into the water. Everyone panics, terrified, as they lose sight of him in the water. Suddenly, Jed emerges, laughing and saying, "I was just messing with you." Unfortunately, it wasn't the time for such jokes. At that moment, a shark attacks him in the water. They quickly pull him out, narrowly saving him from the deadly attack, but he loses his leg entirely. Marty tells Rosa to stand behind the curtains so she doesn't see the horrific scene, and she tries to care for Jed's wounds. Marty uses some of the seatbelts from the plane seats to tightly wrap around the wound to stop the bleeding. Afterward, Danilo opens the plane's storage compartment to retrieve the diving gear inside, but the compartment is flooded with water. However, Ava doesn't give up. She dives into the water and searches for the gear until she finds the bag containing the equipment. She brings it back to the group, but they're shocked to discover the bag only has 4 diving suits. Suddenly, a loud, heavy thud hits the plane from the side. When they look out the window, they don't see anything, but they assume it must be a shark. Shortly after, Jed succumbs to his wounds and blood loss. Ava tries to perform first aid on him, but it's no use. Marty then tells her, "He's gone, there's no use in trying anymore." Suddenly, the plane begins to sink again, just like before. They all start to lose hope of being rescued. Water begins to rise much faster this time, and they realize they need to act quickly and get out immediately. They decide to use Rosa's bubble-blowing trick in the water to distract the sharks. They plan to use oxygen tanks to create these bubbles. Kyle is terrified and reveals that he has a phobia of swimming, but Ava and Rosa encourage him to overcome his fears. Ava collects the oxygen masks from the plane seats without diving too far forward to avoid the sharks. Meanwhile, the sharks gather around the plane, aggressively ramming into it. Inside, the group changes into their swimming and diving gear. Marty tells them, "I'll stay behind because we only have 4 diving suits." She emphasizes that they must look after her granddaughter, Rosa. Ava explains they only have 2 oxygen tanks. One will stay with Rosa, and the other will be shared among the remaining 3, passing it to each other every 2 minutes. After saying their goodbyes to Jed, Ava, Rosa, Kyle, and Danilo dive into the water in their suits. Suddenly, the plane splits in half. Marty tells Ava to take Rosa first, and they begin swimming through the plane's corridor. However, they spot a shark at the end of the corridor. Quickly, they use one of the oxygen masks to create bubbles in the water, successfully distracting the shark. It swims away from the area. Then Danilo and Kyle dive in too, while Marty stays behind, watching as the water rises around her. Accepting her fate, she remains in place. Kyle, overwhelmed with fear and panic, tries to swim back, but a shark suddenly emerges from the compartment, attacking and killing him in an instant. Danilo swims quickly and catches up to Ava and Rosa. On their way, they come across the second diver's body. They take his oxygen tank and continue until they finally reach the exit. Danilo and Rosa make it out, but a shark appears, blocking Ava's path. Terrified, Ava freezes in place. The shark swims past her, but its tail strikes her oxygen mask, knocking it off. Ava notices more sharks entering the plane. She begins swimming toward the exit again, but the plane shifts and sinks further. Despite this, Ava doesn't give up. She keeps swimming until she finally escapes the plane. Exhausted and out of oxygen, Ava tries to swim to the surface but loses consciousness. Thankfully, her life jacket keeps her afloat. She regains consciousness and breathes again. Looking around, she doesn't see Danilo or Rosa, leaving her frightened and alone in the middle of the dark ocean. Suddenly, a rescue helicopter appears and lifts her aboard. Overjoyed, she is relieved to see Danilo and Rosa have also been saved. With that, the events of our movie conclude. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support our channel if you like this video.